Hello everybody. The objective of this video is to learn compare how to compare objects based on identity and value. And also we're gonna learn about truth value of an object and how to figure that. And we'll also go over how to check the membership of an object in a sequence or a container. But before that, I'm going to assume that you all did a meaningful attempt to the reading quiz before this video. If you didn't, please go back and do a meaningful attempt. So in Python, two objects are identical if and only if they are same. We can use is and is not operators to test on this. So basically, is not gives you the opposite outcome of is. Okay. So let's take an example. Number 1 equals 10, number 2 equals 10. And if you do this, number 1 is number 2, and it returns true. And we can use the ID function to check on this as well. Okay. And we'll get, if you use the ID, and we'll see that they're equal. Okay. So let's test on this. So we have number 1 equals 10. Number 2 equals 10. And number 1 is number 2 returns true. And if you want to use the other, number 1 is not number 2 returns false. And we can check this using the ID function. So ID of number 1 equals this, and ID of number 2 equals this. You can see that they are equal. Okay. And if you check ID of 10, that also the same. Okay. So let's try to figure this out, make sense this in a memory diagram. Okay, so I'm gonna our number 1 that equals 10. Okay, and in Python, basically, when we have the assignment statement, that is to say, number 1 is referring to the value 10 that is somewhere in the memory. Okay. So when we do the number 2, number 2 also referring to the same value, that is 10, that is in somewhere in memory. So there's a single memory location that 10 is sitting, and both numbers, number 1 and number 2 referring to that location. So this ID value of 10 is what we got. Okay. And they have the both same ID value. Okay. Memory diagram. It's because when we have the assignment statement, we tend to think in mathematically, which is not exactly the case in programming, definitely in Python. So assignment statement means it's an operation that happens from left to right. So you better basically in your mind or in a piece of paper use the reference diagram. Okay, and if we do that like this, now it makes sense. They're both pointing to a single value 10 sitting in somewhere in memory. Okay. And by the way, this ID function returns a unique integer number, like right here, that represent that memory address. Okay. So let's go back to our presentation. So let's now we know how to now compare objects identity. So let's see how we can compare objects value. Okay. How do we compare objects value? And we already know that we can use any of these operators: equality, less than, greater than, less than or equal, greater than or equal, and not equal. But we know that if it is a number, we can simply use this operator to do a comparison. But how about for other types of object? We need to have a criteria defined for comparison for those objects too. So let's find out what they are. Well, the default is, we already went over that, identity value. For numbers, including floating point numbers, integers, and other types like complex, we use the mathematical convention, respective mathematical convention to compare. Right? For example, 5 is greater than 2. 5 is less than 10. Okay. Oh. Now let's see how we can compare text or string. Text sequence like strings, we compare them in programming following lexicographical order. In Python, basically Python uses an encoded number for each character in comparison. For that, Python used ORD function, and it goes and check each character between the two strings and compare using the ORD value, ORD function. So ORD function returns the Unicode numerical value and then Python uses the two numbers to figure out which character is the largest and which is the smallest. Okay. I'm not going to go into the details, but I encourage you guys to read about lexicographical order right here. How about the sequences? Lists, tuples, and ranges. They compare only within the type. For example, you cannot compare a list with a tuple, and it returns a type error. Otherwise, we're going to go into the same lexicographical order. Okay, so let's check this out. We have apple, and going to test with these. Sorry. And it returns true because this small p has a higher ORD value than this big P. can check that out. ORD letter P is greater than ORD letter big P. That's true. Okay. So in comparison, Python goes and compare corresponding letters, and when it encountered that is not equal, and that's when it takes a decision whether it's greater than or less than. You can read more on right here. So let's move on to check on truth value testing. In Python, any object can be tested for its truth value. It's basically to use as a Boolean value. In fact, Python infers a Boolean value when it requires or when it expects a Boolean value. Python tries to infer a Boolean value when it expects a Boolean value. So, in general, an object considered true unless the object none or false, and it makes sense, right? If it is none, and it's not true. So, none or false, numeric 0 is considered false, empty sequence or collection also considered false. This makes sense, right? There's nothing in a container or sequence, so we better take it as false rather than true. And same for numeric value as well. Only 0 is considered false, all the other numbers considered true. So let's check this out. I'm going to use the bool built-in method to obtain the corresponding Boolean value. So bool, let's pass none first, return false. Of course, you can return false and return false as well. So you can pass false and return false. Let's pass numeric 0 and it returns false. If we pass numeric 10, it's true. Pass numeric negative 10, it's true as well. Checking on empty containers, let's pass empty string, and it's false. Non-empty string, just single space, it's true. And empty list, it's return false. Non-empty list turns true. So we have this, and you will see that when you use these kind of conditions, these kind of values, you can actually create Boolean expression out of these, and you can also use them in conditional statements too. And that's why that is where Python going to infer. Okay, and we'll encounter those as we move on move through this module and also other modules. So let's check on the membership check. We use in and not in operators to test for a membership. Okay. So, for example, to check whether the letter big P in Python, you can use the in operator. And it works the same for any other container as well. So let's check on this. So the letter P in Python, oops, so be a string literal, it's true. And if you use the not in operator, and it returns false. Same with a list as well. So 1 in the list 1, 2, we have it's true, and 3 in this list is false, not in there. So it works the same way with any container too. And when you learn about these data structures, you will learn about more on these tests. And obviously we saw that not in returns the opposite of in. Okay. And in next video, we're going to learn about how we use these Boolean values in programming. So we learn about Boolean expressions and Boolean values. Then next video, we're going to learn about how we can use them in programming, basically in selection or in conditional statements.